This woman called 911 7 times in 1 week. Why? Because I moved my ranch mailbox 3 feet to help our elderly mail carrier, this deranged HOA president asterisk. She thought a 3-foot mailbox shift was a crime. She didn't know I owned the land. Her house sits anand. Now she's about to lose everything. Moving the mailbox had been a simple decision based on practicality. The original spot was too close to the old gate, which was being replaced with a wider, automated entrance. The new driveway design required slightly altering the placement of the mailbox only 3 feet to the left, well within the property boundary. The shift didn't obstruct the road, block anyone's view, or interfere with any neighbors. But the moment the mailbox moved, trouble started. The neighborhood had long been subject to an overbearing HOA, with a few board members who took their roles a bit too seriously. Chief among them was Karen, a longtime resident who had made herself infamous for petty complaints and exaggerated violations. Whether it was a lawn that was half an inch too tall or a flower pot not matching the house paint, Karen would report it. Her goal wasn't maintaining community standards. It was control. And anyone who stepped out of line, even slightly, became her next mission. Within 24 hours of the mailbox being moved, a bright orange notice appeared on the front door. It claimed the structure violated HOA aesthetic regulations and possibly encroached on shared space, though there was no such thing. The document wasn't even signed by legitimate authorities, was typed on HOA letterhead, but the language was clearly emotional and accusatory. It referred to the change as unauthorized construction and demanded immediate removal. What followed was even more absurd. That same evening, a local patrol car slowly drove by the property multiple times. Around sunset, the officer finally stopped. He was polite but uncomfortable, clearly unsure why he'd been dispatched. He explained that someone had reported a suspicious alteration to a mailbox in a shared zone, to walk in the area, and realizing there was no safety or legal issue, the officer apologized and left. The situation could have ended there, but it didn't. Karen escalated. She began sending daily photos of the mailbox to the HOA group chat. She even drew digital red lines on the images, trying to argue that it now intruded on common view. Sightlines. She stirred up minor drama, claiming that neighbors had expressed concern, though none had. Several privately messaged support, saying they were tired of her constant meddling. Still, Karen's influence on the board meant that the violation was added to the upcoming meeting agenda. Emails from the HOA began arriving, requesting official documentation for the relocation. They wanted engineer certifications, design, permits, and proof of HOA approval law, things that weren't needed for a standard mailbox on private land. The mailbox was identical in design to the previous one and had simply shifted slightly to the side to fit the new driveway layout. It wasn't fancy or disruptive. But that didn't matter to Karen. Karen's fixation grew irrational. She began driving by the property slowly, sometimes stopping in front of the house and taking photos from her car. Her tone in the HOA group turned aggressive. She called to move a slippery slope toward neighborhood decay and accused the homeowner of testing the limits of regulation. When challenged by others, she doubled down, claiming she was just protecting the integrity of the community. But it was clear that her actions weren't about regulations, they were personal. She called for an emergency HOA vote to retroactively apply new guidelines for mailbox placement, even suggesting new rules that would require approval for any adjustments over 6 inches. The proposal didn't pass, but it showed the lengths she was willing to go. Her obsessive micromanaging was no longer just annoying, it was starting to feel harassing, despite all the drama. The mailbox remained untouched. It stood clean and sturdy, placed on private property, well within legal boundaries, and clearly not violating any codes. To confirm that everything was legally sound, the homeowner reviewed the original property deed and zoning documents. Everything aligned perfectly. The HOA had no authority to enforce what it was threatening. But Karen didn't stop. Squeege. She began spreading rumors in the neighborhood about illegal renovations. She told others that the homeowner was known for cutting corners and had a history of ignoring rules. None of it was true, but the goal was intimidation. She wanted to make an example out of the situation, as if showing that no one was allowed to act independently without her consent. The overreaction to a simple mailbox adjustment revealed much more than her dislike for change. It exposed a need for control that had gone unchecked for far too long. Most neighbors stayed silent to avoid her wrath, but behind the scenes, they were tired. The constant citations, the anonymous complaints, and now this absurd campaign against a mailbox Karen had made herself an enemy to the very community she claimed to protect. What Karen didn't know was that her obsession would soon backfire. In her effort to punish someone over 3 feet of mailbox movement, she triggered a chain of events that would ultimately uncover something far more serious: her own home sitting on disputed land. What began as a minor change on one property was about to cause a major disruption to hers. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about boundaries, literal, legal, and personal land. Karen had just crossed all of them. Karen's behavior wasn't sudden or out of character. It was a pattern that had slowly infected the entire neighborhood. Ever since she managed to get herself appointed to the HOA board 5 years ago, she treated the position less like a volunteer civic duty and more like a personal regime. What started as routine oversight quickly turned into obsessive interference. No change, no improvement, no movement happened in the neighborhood without her trying to dictate it. She monitored lawns like a military inspector, measuring grass with a ruler if she thought it looked half an inch too tall. Holiday decorations had to be cleared by mid-January or face a fine. Children weren't allowed to draw with sidewalk chalk on shared walkways, and residents were frequently told that even minor garden ornaments needed aesthetic review to preserve the look of the community. Complaints flowed, mostly anonymous, but it was obvious who was filing them. Karen's signature style of overreach was unmistakable. New families moved in unaware, thinking they were joining a peaceful, well-managed community. Within weeks, they would be receiving cold notices about things like excessively colorful mailboxes or unapproved seasonal wreaths. Most tried to comply to avoid conflict. Some pushed back quietly, but got nowhere, since Karen had allies on the board who backed her every time. They weren't as extreme as she was, but they didn't want to be targeted either, so they stayed silent and let her dominate. Fear, not order, was how she maintained control. There had been previous incidents. A veteran who had put up a small American flag on his porch received a citation because the pole wasn't mounted at an approved angle. A young couple who painted their front door navy blue had to repaint it to beige because the color wasn't in harmony with the earth tones of the neighborhood. A retiree who added a bird bath to her lawn received a violation for installing decorative features without prior written consent. In each case, Karen was the one who started the complaint. She didn't enforce the rules, she weaponized them. Behind the scenes, many neighbors quietly resented her. Group texts not monitored by the HOA became safe zones to vent. Name became synonymous with stress. Her behavior, a constant source of anxiety. But people rarely confronted her directly. She was relentless. She responded to any criticism with formal emails, threatened legal escalation, and quoted bylaws like scripture. Even those who served with her on the board knew better than to challenge her unless they wanted their personal lives made miserable. The HOA meetings themselves had turned into one-sided lectures. Karen dominated the floor, drowning out any opposing view with procedural jargon and passive-aggressive remarks. Those who disagreed with her were often gently reminded of their duty to community harmony. If that didn't work, Veiled threats about enforcement or potential fines usually silenced them. Over time, the board ceased being a collaborative group and became more of a rubber stamp for her agenda. When the mailbox situation occurred, it wasn't really about the mailbox. It was about someone stepping out of line without her permission. It was about power. That small, 3-foot shift represented a direct challenge to her authority. She couldn't stand that someone had made a visible change without asking her or seeking approval. In her mind, the neighborhood had a chain of command. She sat at the top of it. No act, no matter how minor, could go unpunished if it wasn't filtered through her control. Her obsession wasn't fueled by rules, it was fueled by ego. She viewed the HOA as her personal domain, and each mailbox, fence post, or flower bed was part of the kingdom she controlled. People didn't question her because she kept them too exhausted to fight back. The process of contesting a violation was so drawn out, so full of paperwork and appeals, that most gave up halfway through. That was her strategy: make non-compliance so exhausting that submission became the easier path. Karen had become so consumed by her own authority that she no longer saw her neighbors as equals. She saw them as subjects in need of constant management. The idea that someone could make a minor change on their own property within legal limits without her involvement felt like an insult. Her reaction to the mailbox wasn't logical because it wasn't about logic. It was about domination, and she had grown used to winning. No one had stood up to her and succeeded. Her enforcement record was virtually perfect. Even when she was wrong, she spun the narrative, blamed miscommunication, and found a way to walk away untouched. Her confidence had reached dangerous levels. She believed she could not be challenged. That belief was about to collapse under the weight of her own overreach. Because this time, her victim wasn't just another passive resident. This time, she picked a fight with someone who had done their homework, someone who didn't just comply out of fear, but responded with facts, evidence, and a plan. Karen thought she was punishing someone for defiance. But what she had really done was draw attention to something buried in the ground beneath her own home. Something that would turn the balance of power upside down. Her obsession with control had gone too far. And now, instead of enforcing rules, she was about to answer to them. The pressure from Karen wasn't just irritating, it was relentless. What started with a mailbox had spiraled into a barrage of HOA threats, passive-aggressive messages, and whispers throughout the neighborhood. Each attempt she made to escalate. The situation was designed to wear down resistance, to force submission by exhaustion. But this time, instead of backing down, the target chose a different approach, uncovered the facts, and exposed the truth. The first step was ordering a professional land survey. It wasn't cheap, and it wasn't quick, but it was necessary. The goal wasn't just to validate the mailbox placement. It was to eliminate any gray area Karen might exploit. When the surveyors arrived, they brought state-of-the-art equipment, historical plats, and access to archived boundary data. They began measuring, marking, and mapping out every inch of the property down to the inch dot. At first, the focus was simple: prove that the relocated mailbox was within the legal property line. But as they moved deeper into the records, a new anomaly emerged: discrepancy in the boundary lines, one so old and overlooked that it never appeared in routine county inspections. It was buried in decades-old land use documentation, dating back to a time when the parcels in the area had been divided hastily during rapid development. The result was a subtle, easily missed overlap, one that had gone unchallenged for years. What the survey revealed was that a portion of Karen's property, including part of her backyard and even the corner of a home extension she'd added years ago, had been built on land that legally belonged to the neighbor she had been harassing. The legal property line had been misinterpreted based on an outdated easement map, and no one had noticed until now. It wasn't a matter of a few inches. The encroachment spanned several feet, enough to matter in a legal dispute. It affected not only land use rights, but also future property value, resale potential, and liability. The garage bump out, the new patio stones, and even a decorative shed were all technically sitting on someone else's land. The homeowner, who had been wrongfully targeted, now had a choice: overlook the finding and maintain the peace, or pursue legal recognition of the property boundaries and assert their rights. Given everything that had transpired, the harassment, the false violations, the police call, and the HOA intimidation, the decision became clear. Karen hadn't just poked the bear, she'd handed it legal ammunition. Before taking any legal steps, the homeowner had the land survey formally documented and submitted to the county office for validation. The official stamp made it undeniable. The line was real, the encroachment was measurable, and the law was on the side of the person she'd tried to crush. A title attorney was consulted next to cross-reference deeds, SMENTs, and zoning certificates. They confirmed the error wasn't the homeowner's responsibility. It was a historic oversight that had gone uncorrected during a rushed phase of subdivision. But the current legal owner of that land had every right to enforce their claim now that the facts were documented. If Karen wanted to challenge it, she would need to present equally valid records. Those didn't exist. What made the situation worse for Karen was her own previous arrogance. She had often bragged during meetings about not needing permits for her additions because she had board authority. But that confidence was now her weakness. If she had filed proper documentation, the issue might have surfaced earlier and she could have negotiated. But by bypassing official processes, she had effectively built on someone else's land without any legal cover. The legal notice was drafted with precision. It wasn't aggressive or inflammatory. It simply stated the findings of the survey, the legal ownership of the disputed section, and a request to either vacate the encroached area or enter a purchase negotiation for the square footage at fair market value. It gave Karen 30 days to respond before legal action would be initiated. When the notice was delivered to her mailbox, the same mailbox she had tried so hard to erase, neighbors took notice. Whispers of the boundary dispute spread quickly. People who had once feared Karen now watched with curiosity. The woman who had issued fine after fine was finally on the receiving end of something far more powerful. Facts. Karen initially responded with denial. She claimed the survey was incorrect, accused the homeowner of fabricating records, and told others she was being harassed by a bitter neighbor. But her words lacked weight this time. She couldn't provide documentation of her own. A property plat on file with the county didn't match her assumptions. The permits she claimed to have never existed. And worse, the home extension that now sat partially over someone else's land was not approved at all. The power dynamic shifted overnight. Karen's confidence, once unshakable, began to crack. She no longer patrolled the streets with a clipboard. She no longer posted warnings on doors. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood had something they hadn't felt in a long time: relief. This wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about dismantling a toxic power structure built on intimidation and misinformation. The survey had uncovered more than misplaced property lines, had revealed the foundation of Karen's false authority. And now, with the truth on paper and the law on their side, her reign of control was beginning to collapse. As news of the boundary dispute began to circulate, the neighborhood's dynamic shifted dramatically. For years, Karen had operated from a position of unchecked power. She had ruled with a strict interpretation of the HOA bylaws, and had used technicalities as weapons. But now, her authority was under real threat, not from a complaint or a committee vote, but from a legal document with hard evidence behind it. The tables were turning, and everyone felt it. The once intimidating HOA notices stopped coming. Karen, who used to walk the streets with a clipboard and a self-righteous stare, suddenly became scarce. Her usual morning strolls turned into hurried glances from her windows. She stopped attending board meetings in person and began dialing, and instead using a weak internet connection as an excuse to avoid direct confrontation. The power she had clung to was slipping, and she could feel it. Meanwhile, the homeowner she had targeted was no longer alone. Residents who had previously remained silent began speaking up. Kay remembered the fines for tiny weeds, the threats over kids' sidewalk drawings, the letters about curtain colors and garden stones. They remembered how she had silenced dissent with legal threats and weaponized policies she barely understood. Her overreach had left behind years of resentment, and now that someone had proven she wasn't untouchable. The rest followed. Complaints against Karen's behavior began surfacing at board meetings. Former board members admitted they had been pressured to support her motions or risk being removed. Residents started gathering documentation of Karen's past violations of procedure times when she imposed fines without full board votes, altered meeting minutes, or conducted unapproved inspections on residents' property. Patterns of abuse that had once been ignored were now being brought to light. One neighbor came forward with emails from Karen that bordered on harassment, repeated messages threatening fines over minor landscaping decisions, tone-deaf accusations, and warnings of further action if changes weren't made. Another neighbor, a retired city planner, offered to help others draft formal complaints and review HOA bylaws. The fear that had once kept people quiet had been replaced with collective courage. The board, once Karen's rubber stamp, now had to take notice. With the growing unrest and the property line dispute now in the hands of lawyers, the HOA's own liability was at stake. They called a special meeting, one that Karen didn't control. For the first time in years, residents showed up in full force. There were no polite nods, no quiet agreement. People spoke their minds. They wanted answers. Questions were raised about Karen's additions to her home that had been built without visible permits. Residents wanted to know how she had been allowed to expand her patio and install fencing that clearly overstepped into what was now proven to be private land. A local real estate agent explained that such encroachments, if not addressed, could derail the property's title and resale value for both parties. The board, clearly overwhelmed, agreed to hire independent legal counsel to investigate further. Karen tried to deflect. She claimed the boundary issue was a clerical error, a smear campaign by someone who couldn't follow simple HOA standards. But her tone lacked conviction. Without evidence, without permits, and now without support, her defenses fell flat. Her allies on the board remained silent, no longer willing to risk their own reputations. The tide had fully turned. Back at her home, Karen began to experience the isolation she had imposed on others for years. Packages were left at her gate instead of the door. The neighborhood kids stopped waving when she passed. Former friends no longer visited. The very community she claimed to protect was now distancing itself, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. Her behavior had gone unchecked for too long, and people were done tolerating it. The legal side continued to unfold. Karen received a formal summons to respond to the boundary encroachment. She didn't vacate or negotiate a purchase, a property. Lawsuit would proceed, and she could face a court-ordered removal of the offending structures. The homeowner who filed the action made it clear it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Ironically, the mailbox, now the most compliant structure in the neighborhood, remained untouched. It had become a quiet symbol of defiance, reason, and justice. What Karen had tried to use as a trigger for punishment had instead become the catalyst for reform. The HOA, now under pressure to repair its image, began reviewing its bylaws for loopholes that allowed Karen to misuse power. Proposals were introduced for mandatory board member training, third-party dispute resolution, and community oversight committees to ensure fairness. The neighborhood had been scarred by years of micromanagement, but it was finally beginning to heal. What Karen had failed to understand was that real authority isn't maintained through intimidation or manipulation. It's earned through respect, fairness, and trust. By trying to control everything, she lost the one thing she needed to lead, the support of her neighbors. Now, as she faced legal consequences and community exile, she was no longer the enforcer. She was the cautionary tale. The lawsuit wasn't filed in anger. It was filed in principle. After months of harassment, intimidation, and unchecked overreach, the legal boundary dispute evolved from a simple land disagreement into a symbol of accountability. The homeowner, whose property rights had been violated, was no longer just defending a strip of land. They were challenging years of abuse that had gone unanswered. The paperwork was clear, the survey certified, and the claims backed by decades-old deeds and public records. The legal machine had begun to move, and Karen could no longer escape its reach. Her first response was defiant. Through her attorney, she denied all claims, insisted the survey was flawed, and even accused the HOA of conspiring against her. But her defense unraveled quickly. Under scrutiny, her home addition had no permit. The shed in question had no zoning clearance. Her fencing had encroached several feet into a neighboring parcel. Her attempt to invalidate the land survey backfired when a court-appointed expert confirmed its accuracy. Facts, not influence now, determined the outcome, facing mounting legal costs and dwindling community support. Karen was forced to enter settlement negotiations, but the homeowner who had brought the case wasn't interested in backdoor deals or confidential apologies. They wanted transparency, and they wanted restitution. A public record needed to be made, not to humiliate, but to ensure that what happened wouldn't happen again. The final agreement required Karen to remove all structures that encroached on the disputed land. This included a portion of her patio, the decorative fencing, and the illegal storage shed. In addition, she was ordered to pay damages for unauthorized use of the property and all legal fees incurred by the plaintiff. But more impactful than the penalties was the precedent. For the first time, someone had successfully stood up to Karen and won. The HOA board, shaken by the exposure, had no choice but to act. An independent audit was commissioned to review past enforcement actions issued by Karen. What they found was troubling. Dozens of violations had been imposed without formal board votes. Several fines were issued without photographic evidence or proper notice. Karen had taken liberties that far exceeded her role, and many of her actions had no legal basis. In some cases, residents had paid fines they didn't even owe, simply to avoid further conflict. Reforms followed quickly. The HOA introduced new bylaws limiting the unilateral power of board members. All citations now required board approval and had to be delivered with documented evidence in a formal appeal process. Residents gained the right to record board meetings, propose agenda items, and review enforcement histories. A third-party mediator was appointed for all future disputes to ensure fairness. What had been a tightly controlled system became, for the first time, a transparent one. Karen's removal from the board was swift and unanimous, though she fought to remain, citing her years of service and claiming the lawsuit was a personal attack. The damage was too great to ignore. Her resignation letter, delivered without ceremony, was read aloud at the next HOA meeting to a room full of relieved applause. Her fall from power didn't just impact her reputation. Her property value took a hit from the encroachment correction, and with court records now public, prospective buyers were hesitant. The same authority she had wielded so confidently became the very thing that left her isolated. She wasn't just disliked, she was distrusted. The neighborhood, however, began to thrive. Without Karen's oppressive oversight, families felt free to personalize their homes, plant colorful gardens, and hang seasonal decorations without fear of reprimand. Children chalked the sidewalks again, porch flags flew without issue. The atmosphere shifted from tense compliance to genuine community. Perhaps most telling was the mailbox. The very structure that had sparked the conflict. It remained exactly 3 feet from its original location, standing upright, clean, and legal. It became a quiet monument in the neighborhood. It's a reminder that even small acts of resistance can bring about lasting change when pursued with purpose and integrity. The homeowner who had been targeted never sought the spotlight. They didn't boast or hold grudges. They simply set out to defend their rights and, in doing so, protected the rights of everyone around them. They reminded the neighborhood that bullies don't always come with threats. They sometimes come with rule books and clipboards. But rules, when misused, can be challenged. Power, when abused, can be taken away. Karen's legacy wasn't the one she imagined. Instead of being remembered as the guardian of order, she became a cautionary tale of how control can corrupt when empathy is lost. Her name would always come with a footnote in the community story, not as a leader, but as a warning. And from that point forward, every board member, every homeowner, every neighbor remembered that authority must be earned, not seized. Lawsuit had ended, but the transformation had just begun. The community had finally reclaimed its voice, and it wasn't giving it up again.